And hello, welcome to our next episode of Burn the Golden Calf. Today we are discussing 1844. If you are Adventist, this number should be very familiar to you. This is when the Adventist denomination first got its start, 1844. We're very excited to be discussing how our early history informs and shapes where we are now with all the rules and things that we have been discussing over the past few weeks. Today, we are very privileged to have our special guest host with us, Geoffrey Marshall. Geoffrey was born in Jamaica, and he was raised in the Adventist church. While he began his education in Adventist schooling, when he got to higher education, he transitioned to secular universities. He has studied in the U.S., although he currently has returned to Jamaica. Geoffrey is also a scientist. When I met Geoffrey, it was the first time I had heard of, and I have forgotten the word already, but it's a science that has to do with water. It's hydrosynthesis. I've never forgotten that. He is a very knowledgeable gentleman who has worked at all different levels of our denomination. He is currently an ordained elder in his church. He works with religious liberties, and he and his wife also work in couples ministry in the East Jamaica Conference. We are so delighted to have you with us today, Geoffrey.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here, Danielle.
Thank you. Now, I was very excited to have you join us to discuss Adventist history. Geoffrey and I, we go very way back. I should say that Geoffrey sees himself as a, what is it? Did you say a moderate? Moderate. Yeah. While those who know me know I tend to lean a little bit more liberal, but I will say I have a tremendous amount of respect for Geoffrey's thought process, his rigor, the way he comes to his conclusions. And so even though we do not agree in every facet, it's not necessary for us to agree in every facet. Facts are facts, information is information. And so I am so excited to be having this discussion here with you. Geoffrey's also going to be sharing some inflection points with us, some points in Adventist history that is, and things change, never to return the same. Geoffrey, I'm kind of excited. What would you consider to be the first inflection point that's really, really important in Adventist history?
Well, of course, I would say it's the title that we have here, 1844. And of course, to be precise, the Adventist Church didn't exist in 1844, but what you had happening there was the Millerite movement. And for those who may not remember, in a nutshell, William Miller, he had come to be, he had a very dramatic conversion experience. And
Mm.
then when he became a Christian, he began to study the Bible. And in studying the Bible, studying the prophecies of Daniel, especially Daniel chapter 7 through 9, he came to the conclusion that Christ was going to return at some point within 1843, 1844. And that began a huge religious movement in the United States at that time called the Millerite movement, where persons from many denominations came together and were proclaiming that soon return of Jesus Christ, as you well know. And well, we're here. Jesus didn't return,
Mm.
but the movement had several dates that were pushed back and pushed back. But the final date that was pushed was October 22nd, 1844, and after that day was called the Great Disappointment. After that date, everything pretty much fell to pieces, and out of the ashes there were persons who just gave up on Christianity altogether, persons who kept setting dates, persons who went back to their churches. But then there was a small group that began to delve into more, saying, okay, something went wrong, but what went wrong wasn't our studies because everything fit. So let's look back at what actually may or may not have happened on at this time. And then out of that group, eventually formed the nucleus of what would become the Seventh-Day Adventist Church.
Fascinating. As I was doing my research for this discussion, I learned that during that time it was commonly thought that the return of Jesus would not be a literal event.
Mhm.
And that puts their thought about being able to figure out exactly where Jesus was going to come in context. Because now in our time, it's like, why would you think when the Bible clearly says? But when you consider the religious beliefs of the time, it's like, well, I guess that wouldn't be as outlandish as it seems now.
That's right. And actually, from what I can recall, the thought process that they had then in terms of that premillennialism, looking at all of this happening before Jesus came, if we look at what the landscape is today, I think that Adventists are the only persons who still hold to that kind of premillennialism. Most Christians are looking at the rapture, saying that when Christ is not going to be raptured and whatever tribulation happens, we're not going to be here for it. So we were the majority then, or that thought was the majority then, and now it's really the minority. So to me, that shows you can't really look too much at being in the majority to say if you're going to be. Both ways.
That is an interesting point. I had not thought about the majority minority switch, particularly as it comes to Adventist belief now in the literal coming versus the rapture. Listen, if you're watching and you were raised in denominations other than Adventism, if you've experienced other religious thoughts about what the end is going to look like, pop that in the comments. Let us know what sort of things you were taught, especially if you were raised outside of the Adventist bubble.
Yeah.
Okay, so we had this, majority minority switch. They had this idea, he's going to come on this date. Jesus does not. They've got to now go back to the drawing board and figure out, okay, where did we go wrong? My understanding is that from that, we got our doctrine of the investigative judgment. Would that be correct?
That's correct.
And it is further my understanding that as we have continued to learn, that's not really what we're pushing so much anymore.
It's I will agree with you that doctrine is not preached a lot anymore. That doesn't mean it's not pushed, because if you look at what the 28 doctrines are, it's still there, and that doctrine is the one doctrine that makes Adventist in the sense that I'm not saying that makes it true.
Okay.
Right? Because at this point, I'm not going to argue for or against it. Full disclosure, I do believe in it, but I'm not going to say you have to believe it to be a Christian. What I am saying is that doctrine is what makes an Adventist, because we're not the only Christians who believe in the Sabbath. We got the Sabbath from the Seventh-Day Adventist. We're not the only Christians who believe in conditional immortality. I'm actually a member of a Facebook group where there are many Christians who are minority but still coming up or saying, when you die, you're not going to go to hell eternally. You're going to burn up eventually. And those Christians are facing strife, so to speak, from their churches, because they're saying you're a heretic. How dare you believe that, it's eternal? How dare you not believe in eternal torment? So there are other Christians who believe that, and
Mm.
and prophecy. Well, we're not the ones who believe in Ellen White per se, but the gifts of the Spirit are for the whole church. So even if you might not believe that Ellen White was a prophet, you can't really say the Spirit can't give someone prophecy. But when you look at the 1844 and the idea of the investigative judgment, or the pre-Advent judgment, as I prefer to call it, then that's the one doctrine that Adventists are pushing, and in a sense, and saying that's a way to consider how exactly, or what exactly what does Jesus do in that process of redemption? Is this step something to consider? And this isn't a talk of the doctrine per se, but I will want to point out that that is the thing that makes Adventists Adventists. If we were to remove it, then we might as well still be Seventh-Day Baptists or something like that.
Okay, so for those who may not know what we're referring to when we say the investigative judgment, and Geoffrey, you can correct me if I make any errors on this, but it's the idea that on the date, the October date that Jesus was supposed to come, instead of it being his coming, it was the day when he moved from the holy place into the most holy place. Is that
Yeah,
correct?
that's
Right.
correct.
And that from there will come a time when probation is sealed, and he goes through the books, and then whoever is filthy, let him be filthy, whoever's clean, let him be clean. And that's kind of how the investigative judgment works. That kind of in a nutshell.
In a nutshell.
Gotcha. Because I remember having a conversation about it with the pastor, and I was saying that, and he's like, "Yeah, but no," and I'm like, we don't anymore? Really? And he brought up the stoning of Stephen, because the investigative judgment teaches that it is only after judgment is done that Jesus, sits down at the right hand of the Father. And he brought up the stoning of Stephen, and that Stephen says, "I see Jesus sitting at the right hand of the Father." And it's like, wait a minute, it does say that. What? Wait. And he was like, "Yeah, that's why you don't hear it talked about as much and preached about anymore." It's like, oh wow. And I think this is one of the reasons why Burn the Golden Calf is, I'm very passionate about it, because I think that there are a lot of things that are commonly accepted in theology now, but we never went back and officially said, "Hey, here's where we are." This we've kind of tweaked a little bit. This is so yeah. We got a question from Jay. She said, "Where is the biblical support for the investigative judgment? I may have opened a rabbit hole here."
Well, I can give you, like I said, the first thing I want to clarify and say is that
Go for it.
you don't have to be. It's not a salvation. Believing in it doesn't make you a better Christian or not a better Christian, right?
There you go.
For me, the evidence of the IJ is best based in Daniel chapter 7. Right? In the sense of, when you look at Daniel chapter 7, you will see where you have the four beasts coming over the earth. You have the lion representing Babylon, you have the bear representing Medo Persia, then you have the leopard representing Greece, and the beast rather with iron teeth, and then the little horn, etc., etc. Now in Daniel 7, there's a point where it says the Ancient of Days, right? You saw one that Ancient of Days, he sat on his throne, the judgment was set and the books were open, right? And so that's a judgment right there. And but then after that, you see, after that situation, that you see they're saying he comes in glory. So you look at the timeline and you see there that between Rome and before the coming, there's a judgment in heaven. Right? And at the very least, to me, that sets the foundation, because I've never heard anyone say, okay, what is that if not a judgment in heaven? I'm not going to hold out and say that it started in 1844 or October 22nd. I'm not going to, I mean, there are differences in belief about prophecy and stuff, and those are fine. But what, for me personally, that foundation there is saying that judgment in heaven that happens after Rome and before the second judgment, the second coming, is something that we would have to explain. The pre-Advent judgment of the Adventists is one form of one explanation for it. It's okay to say you don't agree. I would just want to hear something more. And then tying into that is to Daniel chapter 9, where that looks at that prophecy that is built on Jesus. When you put it in the time frame, that's built on Jesus himself, and it predicts to the T when Jesus would come, right? When he came, what would happen to him, etc. And tying those together gives some kind of foundation for me to say, there's something happening in heaven. And then also, if you look at the parable that Jesus gave of the king at the wedding feast, where he invited persons to come to the wedding feast and they didn't come, and he said, okay, he's going to open the doors and bring them in, and he gave each of them a robe of righteousness.
Mm,
He went in to the banquet place, and he's looking at the person that then he meets someone who did not have on the robe, and he asked
mhm,
the guy, no, where's your robe? And the guy didn't have an answer. So that to me is a sign of like investigation, showing that the robe of righteousness, because it's not our righteousness, it's never our righteousness. But the thing is saying, do we have on the righteousness of Christ? Are we living by for ourselves, or are we living with Christ? And that kind of proof investigation, I think, is just an example of why I think there's some evidence for it. I'm not going to say you have to believe it. What I
mm,
am saying is that it's not many persons put as a cut and dry thing, saying, "Oh, it's raw. No, there's no support for it," and that's not completely so. It may be a bit awkward, it may be a bit unpopular, but it's not without some basis and some foundation that can be considered. Even if you disagree, there is some foundation for it to be considered, in my opinion.
that's fair. That's fair. That's fair. Okay, so we have this. Okay, let's retweak what
Yeah,
we thought. Let's figure out where we were wrong. Try and get back on track. That was my
yeah.
bad. And from there,
Mhm,
we have these little groups that are forming and that are studying, and at
mhm.
some point they need to coalesce into a denomination. So
Right.
where do you think our next inflection point comes?
Well, I would say it wouldn't come when E.J. White had her first vision, which was in December 1844.
Mm,
It wouldn't necessarily come either when the group of between herself, her husband James White, and Joseph Bates, then they met Rachel. I think her last name was Fairclough or something. Well, she was a Seventh-Day Baptist who brought the Sabbath into the movement. But it's when they decided to move from a movement to say, okay, we're growing kind of big, it's getting kind of unwieldy. We didn't like organization, but we have to organize. And so in
mm,
1863, then the official Seventh-Day Adventist denomination was formed by the well, the laws of the land, so to speak. They came together, had their conference, and formed the Seventh-Day Adventist Church, and thus became the organization that we are all a part of here today.
gotcha, gotcha. And you mentioned that at the time they were anti-organization,
Yeah.
but they chose to become an organization out of necessity. What
Mhm.
was it that spurred the anti-organization sentiment?
Okay, I'd have to. This is off the top of my head, but
Sure,
from
sure.
what I can remember or what I can imagine, it's saying if you're coming from a movement, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because the 1844 movement, the Millerite movement, was ecumenical. People were coming from all different places, and they were persecuted by their churches for believing in that. So when you're coming out now, you're saying you're still in the movement. You have a message that you're presenting. You're preaching that message of the soon return of Christ in a real sense, not setting a date, but the soon return. You're moving. You're preaching all these things, and you don't want to become that which you were persecuted with, right?
Mm,
So you said you don't want to formalize this thing. You got something nice happening here. You want to keep just let it flow. You want it to keep going. But the more you grow and the more you're trying to reach the world and the more you're trying to get a bigger and bigger organization becomes a necessity. And also
mm.
they were saying they didn't want to have any creed, which is I guess that's ironic because you see you don't want to have no I believe in the one, etc. You don't want that, but yet here we are with the 28th fundamental.
How far we've
Um,
come.
so, but it's a balance because or even this organization is organization, and even if you don't have a creed, you need to have something that you believe. What do you believe? Is that anything you believe you're Adventist? So there has to be something that you stand for. So they realize the necessity for that, and out of that the organization became and the Seventh Day Adventist Church, and they chose the name Seventh Day Adventist because technically speaking, all Christians are Adventists, awaiting the advent of
Mm.
Christ. So, but that's where that came from.
And what is interesting that I learned was that while Seventh Day Adventists formed in at one time, it was a few years later before they coalesced into and created a GC, a
Yeah,
general conference,
that's right.
that then added the hierarchy into the organization.
That's right. Between saying, okay, we're going to, because then they began to say, okay, how are we going to set out missionaries? And they sent out Jane Andrews, I think he was the first official missionary, and then organizing the work, spreading out, how are you going to get it? And then they built up to the divisions and the unions and all those things. Say, we have to organize, we have to organize. And organization is good, but the thing that I guess we can consider the fact that the bureaucracy happens. Eventually, an organization may reach a point where it may forget its mission and begin focusing on its existence.
Hmm.
But that's a different topic. That's another golden calf that needs to be burned.
Well,
I'm not going to digress any further on that one.
no, and I mean, I think we touched on that a little bit in on our discussion about tithing,
Mm,
where the views on tithing shift. That early in our history, there was an idea that tithe was an Israelite thing, and so it wasn't binding on current believers. But then, as organization needs funding, there's like, okay, well, those of us who work within the denomination, we will help fund it with 10% of our income.
mhm,
And then it was, well, actually, that's not enough to fund the organization. We need everybody now to
mhm.
be doing the 10%. And then it kind of snowballed from there
Yeah.
to, okay, well, actually, this needs to be a doctrine that you should give because it's not just Israelites, everybody needs to. And it just kind of snowballed from there. And it's interesting when you look at the history and you see how in many areas we have gone from A to Z in what we believed in the beginning, and then here we are over there, or we
Yeah.
flip flopped.
Mhm. Yeah, it's because the thing is, you believe, and it's not necessarily that you have to flip flop, but you see the necessity of change. Because if
Hmm.
I'm not the same person that I was when we met 10 years ago, and I
Very
know
easy.
you're not the same person either. So
Absolutely not.
as you as you grow, your beliefs will change. As you get more information, you might have believed one thing and then it changes again. So change in and of itself, in terms of flip flopping, isn't bad. But the question, I guess, is looking at the principle and saying, not holding on to something because that's what we've always done, but is there a need for change? No. Is there a better way to do it? Is there a more effective way to do it? Are we taking the principle of 10%, which belongs to God, and misapplying it to saying that it has to go here or there or everywhere else? Is there somewhere other way that which we can fund the church? Again, that's another topic, and it's a touchy one
It
because we're talking about money.
is.
And it is if you remember from The Wire, where Lester Freeman said, you follow the drugs, you get the young guys, but you follow the money, you don't know where you're going to go. So money
Mm.
is a big topic, but like I said, that's another golden cow.
Yeah, there it is. It is, and we did technically already burn that one. But I do think that it is interesting how as we have grown,
Mhm.
I don't think I have seen either now or in our history a a categoric expression that we once thought this, we then realized that either this was wrong or we needed to grow beyond this. There seems to be a sense of we are going to try to PR this in such a way that it's like, well, we weren't wrong. We weren't wrong. We
Mm.
have just received further light.
It's it's interesting that you would say that because that ties very well into the next inflection point, which I
Mm.
think reflects across Adventism, even today now, across all parts of Adventism. That's in 1888, righteousness
Mhm.
by faith. Because at that event, you had Ellen White, AJ Wagner, no, EJ Wagner, and A.T. Jones, who were proclaiming the truth and the fact that, the just shall live by faith. We are saved
Mhm.
by grace.
Mhm.
And they received a big fight because the persons in charge at the time, Uriah Smith and the president, I remember his name, but he's there, and they were saying, no, there's something, there's a part we have to play in this thing. It's not just about,
Mhm.
God needs our help, and the Adventist Church has really been struggling with that onwards, in a sense. So when in
Mhm.
terms of the back and forth, because they said, yeah, we're justified by faith, but that bond is
Mhm.
always there, and it's a strong tension because we know the importance of the Sabbath, we know the importance of the law, we know the importance of doing the right thing, and it's very tricky. It's very tempting for us to say, because we do the right thing, therefore we're so good because we do the right thing. God has to save us because we do the right thing. We're all that. We're so nice, and then say no. Our righteousness is filthy rags. We're saved by grace, by Christ, and by that alone, lest any one of us shall boast. I said, yeah, okay, we're saved by grace, so I can do whatever I want. No, we
Mhm.
establish a law. I said, okay. And so it goes back and forth from there. And many of the other inflection points are coming from that tension. But that balance between being a Seventh day and being an Adventist is
Mm.
something that we all struggle with, I think. Between and they don't say, and it goes on in the sense of saying, well, we know we're a peculiar people. The things we do, we have to be vegetarian. We have to do the right thing. We have to be vegetarian. We have to do the right thing. We have to be modest. We have to do the right thing. We have to not be outgrown. And then we take that, I think, many times and make that a standard where it shouldn't be a standard, but the temptation is there because that's what we know, and we said we want to do the right thing, we want others to do the right thing, so let's enforce it or let's put it forward. But that balance at 1844, and it's important to note for all of those who may not like Ellen White that she was they didn't she was on that side saying righteous by faith, and when they did that, when she saw that the church exiled her,
Mm.
they'll say, okay, you say that let's get this on this the prophetess, put her aside a little bit. Let's do our thing. So nobody is immune, so to speak, from being put out of the mainstream in that sense. But that's another golden flag, golden
Well,
calf.
no, and I think that that is a very, because I didn't realize that that was the issue that got her the boot.
Yeah.
And this is another one of those areas where the history has this very fascinating ebb and flow, because right now everything is Ellen White, Ellen
Mm,
White, Ellen White. And
mm,
you would never believe there was a time when the organization was like, yeah, no, not Ellen White. No, as a matter of fact, let's buy you a one-way ship
cricket
ticket to
to the
Australia.
other side of the world, and she they did that because she was on what I believe was the right side. She was saying, no, we are saved by grace, not by faith. And the one thing we can say about Ellen White, whether you agree with her or not, is that she grew in her understanding of many things,
Mm.
and she was someone, she'd never had the view of herself that many persons have of her. And that's the best I can say about her in a lot of things.
Agreed. At some point in the future, there's definitely going to have to be a conversation about Auntie Ellen.
Definitely.
While I myself do not consider I don't consider myself Ellen White. Ellen White. You will very rarely hear me quoting her, just
Mm.
because I personally feel that I should be able to substantiate anything that I say,
Yeah,
either
yeah.
from the Bible or from documented history, what have you. But I do think that there has been a bit of unfairness where she's concerned. That,
Kind of.
if somebody followed you around and collected every scrap of paper you wrote on, including your diaries, your journals, your receipts, your letters, everything, nobody is going to have, a cohesive body of work at that standard. Just
Yeah.
no.
I can share, like, for example, a little bit from my personal experience. When I went to college, right? Like I said, I grew up in an Adventist church, and I went to secular high school. But when you're going to church and when you lived in Jamaica, going to secular high school isn't really that much of a problem because you're still in a Christian quote unquote environment, and I'm still attending church regularly. But when I went to college for the first time, this was back in let me date myself, 1998, and I joined this discussion group of current and former Adventists. Right, it was an email discussion group. First time I was doing that, and that was a baptism of fire. I
Mm.
learned many things I never learned before. I had to defend myself in many things I didn't have to defend before. I'd read before, like I read the Kingdom of the Cults by Walter Martin, and which remains the best objective assessment of Adventism I've ever read. He is fair in what he did says. He presents our beliefs thoroughly and correctly, and while he doesn't agree with them, I can see he tells you why he doesn't, and he also tells you why, even the way he disagrees, why Adventists are still Christians. So I
What's the name of the
highly
book again?
it's his the book is called The Kingdom of the Cults, but there's an appendix in there where he talks about Adventism and gives his point. And that's an inflection point as well, but I'll come to that later on.
Ah, okay.
But I'm saying that reading my experience in that group helped me to both see why I still believed in the Adventist church overall, but also seeing why many persons who are currently not Adventists and who hate Ellen White, I can say I understand.
Mm.
I didn't go through the same thing you did, and I don't think you had to go that way, but I understand completely why you did, because it's rough when someone takes something and is completely what's whacking you over the head with it, you know.
Yeah,
So
true,
I
true.
understand.
And in reading through some of the history of, our Adventism, it was interesting how often people who asked questions or wanted to have, the rigorous discussion and,
Mm,
let's look at the facts, look at history,
mm.
were pushed so far aside that it was like, okay, you know what, I fine, I'll be out. It's like this seems to be a recurring pattern.
It is because that goes to the next inflection point, which many
Hmm.
persons don't know about, and I didn't even know about it much. I remember that the first time I heard about it was when A Today. I know you had Lauren on board previously.
Yes.
A Today had a presentation by the guy who wrote this book. His thesis was done on this, and he wrote a book about the 1919 conference where Adventism began its movement into fundamentalism, because
Mm.
it was like after Ellen White passed away in 1915, and the president at the time, I don't remember his name, I think it was Brascott or something, but he was trying to bring the church into a more progressive way to say, no, let's look at this thing critically. Let's not just set anybody on a goal. Let's not set a golden calf on a pedestal. Let's look at the thing wholeheartedly. But however, the church at that time was influenced by the fundamentalism happening in America at that time.
Mm.
They're becoming a lot more, conservative, a lot more fundamental, and then as well the Adventist church, some persons in the church were trying to be more attractive or gain the favor of those persons. So from that sense, that again you had that pull between, legalism, perfectionism, and grace, freedom, quote unquote. And unfortunately, the legalism won out. From that
Mhm.
point, the fundamentalism began to become the main center, so to speak, of the Adventist Church. And this may not be scientific per se, what I'm about to say, or historical, but it's my belief that fundamentalism set the tone for many of the missionaries that went out. And so when those persons went out to the,
Mhm.
places, to Jamaica, to countries in Africa, etc., they were going there not only with Adventism, but with fundamentalism, fundamentalist Adventism, with white American fundamentalist Adventism, and that set the trend, I think, for much of the conservatism that you might see in, like I say, West Indies, in African Adventism, etc. That kind of cultural thing, and it's not just limited to Adventism. I remember reading a lot about, or reading some stories about how many times missionaries, when they're going out, they're not necessarily teaching Christianity itself, which transcends culture, but they may be teaching colonial Christianity, white
Mm.
Eurocentric Christianity, and that's another golden calf. But that golden calf is bigger than Adventism. That's something that has been discussed at the Christian level, and this is something that we should discuss. But that is something to be considered in terms of how the church became that way.
Yes, and it is interesting how much of what we are facing, as Adventists, is
Mm,
mirrored in the wider conservative Christianity. That
mm,
it's many of these issues are not just within the denominational body;
mm.
it's across the board, of conservative, or as Pastor Rome said, traditional Christianity.
Yeah.
But there does seem to have, like, always been this tussle between, the fundamentalism, the rules, and it's got to be this way, and the more, dare we say, liberal, well, no, it's by grace, it's by Christ. And for whatever reason, every time we have this tussle, the Christ side always loses. I mean, Christ ended up on a cross in part because it's like,
But see, loses is a strong word,
it is a strong word. It might be that be the best word. Yeah.
because I mean, in being on the cross, that was the ultimate victory. And what we know for sure is that God's will must prevail, His church must come through, and His truth will come out. And the remnant is always going to be a remnant, because the
Mm,
question might be said, if you're looking around and you're in the majority, you should be concerned. Which doesn't mean that you have to say, "All right, it's me against the world," but
yes.
you have to consider as well, saying, what's the main point here? Am I defending the status quo because it's a status quo? What do I believe and why do I believe it? And that many times the Adventist Church skews away from that for more reasons than one,
Mm-hmm.
not in an official sense. And it's important for us to not be afraid to look at the church critically. By critically, I don't mean that you're going to tear it down, but to be not afraid to ventilate matters or to
Mm,
hide it. Because if I we're a different type of person, right?
Hmm.
I might have seen things, and those things I might have thought these things were hidden from me. I might have said, okay, if they're hidden from me, then this thing is a whole lie. I'm going to give up on it, as many persons have done. And the truth is that our faith has to be strong enough to withstand evaluation. There is evidence for us to believe what we believe, both as Christians and as Seventh-day Adventists. And we will never be free completely of doubt this side of heaven. You're not going to know for sure what's going to happen until Christ comes anyway. Only then will everything be known. That's why faith exists, not blind faith, but reasonable faith. The substance of things hoped for,
Mm.
evidence of things not seen. So if you're looking for certainty, like as though I am certain that I'm sitting on a chair right now, I'm certain I'm in Jamaica, there's a limit to that, because our own understanding, what it say, trust in the Lord and lead not to your own understanding.
Mm.
Understand? So we have to keep that in mind, that our understanding is important, but it's not the final say. Anytime we put ourselves up as the final arbiter of what's true and what's not, we're going to find ourselves in problems. And the worst part is sometimes we won't even know we're in problems.
This is true. This is true. Wow. And it's kind of funny because it sounds as though, if I get the date correct, it was 1919, you said?
Yeah.
1919, when fundamentalism, as Macia said, spread like fire in a dry forest.
Yeah.
And it seems as though, for all of our talk about not following the world, we kind of were at that point.
Yeah. So I'm still following it. That's where the whole idea of have you heard of? I'm sure you heard of last generation theology.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's Andreessen. He began to develop that around that period, like about 1923, and so that developed, and that has never been an official doctrine of the Adventist Church. Thank God. But it is a belief that many Adventists do hold on to, and that's something that causes a lot of stress. And saying I have to be perfect so that Jesus can come. That's another golden calf to look at, separate from and apart from this. But that leads again into the next inflection point, which brings me back to the issue of Walter Martin in 1957, where the church now is trying to kind of reform itself. Again, more progressives are trying to come and say, okay, we're not so fundamentalist. And now Walter Martin comes, he's writing the book on cults, and he's saying, rather than just write about persons, I'm going to ask these people, what do you believe? Because many times, what I've seen on websites from former Adventists and other Christians is not what Adventists believe or what they think Adventists believe, or what they want you to think Adventists believe. And I'm the
Or they were told Adventists believe.
what they were told Adventists believe. No, I'm the kind of person, you can curse, you can laugh at me for what I actually believe. I don't want you to laugh at me for something that I don't believe, right?
Fair.
So when Walter Martin came, he came and he spoke to the GC, and they sent Leroy Froome, I think it was, to speak with him, and they had a conversation. And out of that conversation came two books. The first book was The Truth About Adventism by Walter Martin, and the content of that book is pretty much caught up in the chapter of that appendix I told you about. Again, The Kingdom of the Cults, appendix, The Puzzle of Adventism. You can read about that. The second book that came out of that was Questions on Doctrine. That was an Adventist book where they took the questions that Walter Martin asked, and they wrote down and they put the answers that the church gave to those questions, right?
That sounds almost like catechism, okay?
Yes, it's not like an official, it's not like a 28 fundamental doctrine thing, but it did provide answers to the questions, speaking like what Adventists believe about certain issues, providing clarity on what we believe about, say, for example, Michael the Archangel, Jesus being Michael, showing that we're not Jehovah's Witnesses who believe that Jesus was created. We do believe that Michael was Jesus before the incarnation, but that doesn't make Michael an angel. It means that Michael was another name for Jesus, right?
Okay.
And stuff like that, and going on. So those questions were answered, and it was published. And that publishing caused problems because, again, one person, I think his name was Brimsmead, he was a disciple of Andreessen with the last generation theology, and he was basically saying, you guys sold out. And so there was that pushback and controversy, so to speak, between the publishing of that book and what it meant, saying we were trying to be more showing that we are Christians. Though we may be different, but we are Christians. We're not like the Mormons or the Jehovah's Witness. And then Grimsby and other similar persons saying, you're selling out, you're trying to butter up, you're giving in, etc. And so there was controversy there. The book itself went out of print for a long time. It was recently reprinted. I remember when I read about that book, I went and I bought a copy on eBay back in the day. It was like an old copy, and I had it and I read it. It's online as well now. You can find a PDF online, and you can also buy the reprinted version in the ABC. And if you read George Knight, he has a lot of commentary and books on that matter. If you're interested in Adventist history, read anything that George Knight has written. That's a free
Yes.
endorsement. I don't know him personally or anything, but I will say I've been blessed by reading his books on that man those matters. So that aspect it helps us a lot because, like I said, anyone who wants to know the truth about Adventism can find it objectively.
Hmm.
And I've always been the first person, and that helped me to realize you can be a true Christian and not be a Seventh-day Adventist. And that was
Mm.
a big step for me to take because many times I know that you can share that when you hear the word Christian, you say Christian equal Adventist. Yeah, if you're not Adventist, you're not a Christian, and that's not true, right? While I believe the Adventist Church has a special message, I'm an Adventist by choice. I believe we are the remnant. I don't think that remnant means we're the only ones to be saved or the only ones worth being saved. And I've said it before, and I'll say it on this public platform. The worst person to be is a Seventh-day Adventist who's following every doctrine to the T and doesn't know Jesus Christ.
Mercy. Mm.
You know, see, every time I say, everyone says, because you know for real. That's like,
Yes.
that's like a Pharisee to the T. But if the Adventist church has Jesus in every doctrine, then we become a church of hope. We become that real hope because we have the hope that says, there's more to life, that this world is not all there is. No matter what happens, if the world is going to come to an end. COVID was bad, some stuff is going to come that's worse, but we have this hope. And that hope is in Jesus Christ. And if you have that as Adventist church, then that's the message I think that when we lift Christ up like that, we will draw all men unto him in that regard.
Well, I mean, there is a professor at Oakwood University, Dr. Gregory Allen, Dr. Gregory Allen, and he is very into Christ and Christ alone. In fact, he has an assignment that he will give some of his classes to rewrite the fundamental beliefs with Christ at the center of them.
That's the way to go, because when you put Christ at the center, then it all falls into place. Even the quote unquote troublesome ones like the pre-advent judgment, Christ is there sealing his persons, right? He's showing this is my blood is covering this person, my blood is covering that person. Christ is there with even Auntie Ellen saying, I gave her the message to help my people, to show that I'm coming again. Christ is there in all of those doctrines, and once we lift up Christ, put him in the middle, then he covers everything.
Agreed. That if we focus on Christ, yes, like Macia said, Christ says, if he be lifted up, if that becomes our focus, then a lot of the little things that we struggle with, and I got to change you, and I got to fix that is like, well, no, you can let all that, because that's not your problem. That's God's problem.
It's not your job. I mean, who can change you right now?
Listen, I struggle to change myself. So
exactly. But when the time we think we can change person, you get married to someone, say, "Oh, I'm going to change. I can change it." No. Only person you can change is yourself. And once we accept that and learn to accept people for who they are, not saying they have to stay there or saying that they're going to accept what they do or say that they're everything. But the thing is, it's not your job. All our job is to do is just love people and to love Christ and to witness for him. Right? It's not more than that. We are not the judge of anybody. That's the key thing to keep in mind.
Well, now, and I think that what you mentioned about loving others brings us to an inflection point that's around the same time that you mentioned that you wanted to discuss, and somebody brought up in the comments either. Lucy, yes.
Yeah, sorry, I jumped. I shouldn't have jumped in. I have to jump back to 1943. And this part is sticky because it's sticky. No, it is sticky. Because this to me is still the biggest issue in our church. For those who don't know the story of Lucy Bayard, she was a black woman who took ill one night in 1943, and she was taken to the White Adventist Hospital in Washington, D.C. She was a light-colored black woman. And she was in there fine and everything until they realized that she was black. Once they realized she was black, they wheeled her out into the hallway and left her alone there. And she stayed there until it was too late. They took her to a hospital where she would be treated, but eventually she died. And that was the straw that broke the camel's back, so to speak. The black church, because even before then there were a lot of issues with because the fundamentalism thing brought up the situation with black Adventists. Because even before 1943 there were stories of like Louis Sheep. I don't know how many people have heard about him. I never knew anything about him until in 2010 when I went to the GC and about the book written on his life. He was an inspiring black Adventist minister who left the church because they would not support integration. This was back in the 1920s, right?
I did not know the story.
The story. It's an important story. Louis Sheaf, look him up, read the story. But all of these things were kind of hidden or not in the public consciousness. But Lucy Byard pushed it there because the black leaders came and said, "All right, this is unchristian. This can't work. We want integration. We need integration. We need to be treated as equals." And what the white church there did was said, "All right, we're not going to treat you as equals, but we're going to give you your own space."
Mm.
And thus regional conferences were born. Because we, the black, well, not we, because I fully disclosure, I'm a Caribbean, I'm a Jamaican, I'm not a black American, right? I fully accept that. At the same time, I did so in the USA, so I believe that I have some exposure to what it's like to be a black person in America.
And thank you for bringing up that nuance, because that's a very important nuance. Thank you for clarifying that. Yeah.
So they said we want equality, and the church pretty much said we're going to give you your own space, not equality, but your own space. And they've taken it, and from there you've seen the success of regional conferences, but that success was built on that tragedy, and the fact that regional conferences still remain, it's necessary. I'll tell you one change I had before I lived in the USA. I thought, why is there separate conferences where we're all one? It should be we're integrated. Having been there and been back, and having seen the reality of what happens and how society reflects in the Adventist Church, regional conferences are still needed. And the sad truth, or my sad belief, is that they will be needed until Jesus comes.
Mm-hmm.
I remember reading a story. I don't know if the story was by Pastor Nixon on his blog or something, but he gave the story of how some black pastor was preaching at a church, a white church, about the situation, and afterwards he was at the door, and a white couple came to him and said, it was good to hear you speak. It's such a pity that we have these separate conferences. We should come together. And he asked them, all right, tell you something. Would you be okay if we merge the conferences, but I was your president and not the white guy? See, your lack of response answers the question. Race is the biggest problem that humanity still has to deal with, and in that sense as well, it's still the biggest problem that the Adventist Church has to deal with. And that is a golden calf for 5, 6, a whole month, a whole quarter's worth of study, if you want to put it that way. But that incident and how race, and it may not be, and the sad thing is that it may be an American thing for the most part, but the Adventist Church is very dominated by what happens in America. You understand? It was formed in America. It was witnesses and goes out. It's transcended America, but the financial base is still there. The leadership is still, for the most part, white Adventist, white males. And the financial, and again, money. Where the money is, that's where the power is.
Yeah.
And so, how we're going to deal with that? That's another discussion that I would love to be a part of, whether in the comments or discussing out here. But that inflection point is why we have regional conferences. It's why we reflect the society we live in terms of the white versus black divide. And then, of course, even it's not just white versus black. It's how do we, as other persons, Latino, Asians, how do we mix, and the balance between being diverse and wanting to be where you're comfortable and where you're with your own people, so to speak. That balance has to be there. But that situation of power and money and authority tied up with race remains a big issue that the church has not dealt with.
It's so true. So true. I remember when, and it's not as discussed now, but when the issue of female pastoral ministry in Asia came up, and especially over in China, they are doing some amazing things over there. But they are doing it in their cultural way. And I think that's one area that we have struggled with, that we are very proud to be a global organization. But as you said, most of our standards, ideas, they come from America, because it was started here. Most of our leadership is here. And so it's very difficult to create a vision that is more global and inclusive of all the various cultures.
Yeah, and I think that comes a point because of that fundamentalist nature that is there, the back and forth, the perfectionism, and that desire to control. Because what would be ideal is that, remember again, Christianity transcends culture.
Yes.
And that transcendation is why the slave, whether you're African American slave or a Caribbean slave, embrace Christianity, because even though that was a religion of their slave masters, they saw the truth in who Jesus was, right? And that's why it's there. It's not
Mm,
because of brainwash, it's because of who Jesus is, why black people are still Christians. It's because
mm.
of Jesus why I am a Christian. If I thought Christianity was a white man religion, I'd be a Rastafarian or something.
Ah, okay.
Even though I can't grow any locks anymore or something, or in the things, right? But we what we have to do in a sense is saying, how does Christianity, because what Jesus did, what Paul did, was to reach the people where they were,
Yes.
right? So you go to a place, you're not going to go there and impose. Like, I'm not going to go. Like, I may be. Like I said, I'm a moderate, right, so to speak,
Hmm.
which means, well, I like different styles of music, but I'm comfortable with hymns and I'm comfortable with piano stuff, and I like the drums and everything as well. But I'm comfortable with that, the more traditional style. But
Mm,
I would not say though I'm going to go and witness. I'm going to go to an urban area or somewhere, and I'm going to impose my style on them to say that's the way it should be.
hmm.
So, like Paul said, I became a Jew to reach the Jews. I became a Greek to reach the Greeks, because
Yes.
what matters is bringing Christ in a way that persons will be able to relate and adapt. So, what happened in China? I remember reading about that. It's not just Adventist churches, Christianity in general, where the missionaries were kicked out. Right, all missionaries
Mm,
were kicked out, and it was sealed off. And the communists thought that that would make Christianity die, but what it did was make Christianity become Chinese.
mm.
So the Christians there grew as Chinese Christians, and
Yes.
therefore it grew on and it grew on, and so it just became even more, you know.
Yes.
So that's one thing to keep in mind. And then one thing, because as Adventists, we have this innate desire coming from the fundamentalism, maybe, to have uniformity. To say, we got to be the same.
Yes.
And what we need is unity, not
Hmm.
uniformity. The
Yes.
flexibility to say, even if the way you worship makes me uncomfortable, that doesn't make it wrong. You do you, and I love you, and I do me, I love me. So, because a lot of times I'll say this, I may see the same kind of disdain coming towards conservative, towards traditional musicians or traditional worship styles coming from other persons. So, what if
Hmm.
I like to do hymns and stuff? That doesn't make me bad. But what it does is what it makes is that I shouldn't judge you, you shouldn't judge me.
There you
And
go.
that flexibility is what I think we need in Adventism, to know when to hold them and when to fold them.
And there also has to be understanding that, we change. Like, even for me, I remember sitting in church once and going, it seems rather loud in here. And I was like, what have I said? What is
Mhm.
happening? What is going on?
You got
It's,
older.
it was like, no. But then I had to think to myself, it's like, okay, you know what? Is it that it's loud, or have you just gotten older and you have a lower tolerance for that? It's like, and I don't think that we can have this nuance. It's like, just because I think it's a certain way doesn't mean it is a certain way, or
Exactly.
that it's wrong, even if it, let's say it was loud. There's nothing wrong with being a little loud.
Nothing wrong with that at all. Nothing wrong with that at all. So,
Yeah.
so having that is something I think that we as Adventists need to have a bit more. Tolerance is the wrong word. Accepting or grace.
Hmm.
Many times we don't have a lot of grace. We need to have that grace, and that will help a lot of things with young people and older versus older people, with cultural differences, with with not theological differences per se, but with different views. Liberal versus conservative versus all those things. That
Hmm.
grace, because there's room for all of us, and that's one thing I do admire about the Adventist Church in terms of it being a worldwide church. That unity that is there. I could go to any Adventist church anywhere, whether it be Revision Church Atlanta, which I love to watch online, or whether it be West Jamaica Conference with Glenn Samuels, or even if it's a small church somewhere else, you will see the thing that makes it Adventist. It's still there. You can go and find something that you can identify with in that regard,
Hmm.
and all of those worship styles and worship arenas are valid in their own way, shape, and form. And if you find one that you enjoy, that doesn't make the other ones just bad. Bad. It makes them things that you find other persons may like and stuff. Because when we get to heaven, they're going to be so. It's going to be so diverse. It's going to be so wonderful. There's going to be
Yes,
a lot of things happening there. If we can't live together down here, how are we going to live together up there?
exactly. This is the practice ground for there, man. Okay, so we're up to the 1950s, I think.
Yeah.
Where are we going from here from our inflection points?
Well, I'd say there was at least one more,
Okay.
which was a theological thing that was Desmond Ford in 1978, 1979,
Okay.
where that ties right back into 1844, where he came up and said, "Yo, I don't believe this is what actually happened." And that, well, if you really want to talk about that, you'd have to invite persons like Lauren or other Adventist pastors who were on board at that time. But basically, what happened there was you had someone who was a bright star, right? A shining light in the church. Oh, dear, my screen just dropped. All right, I'll have to just trust that you guys will see me. My screen went blank.
No, we can still see you.
All right, cool.
Yes.
So what happened is that you have a bright star like a Paul or a Timothy, and then this person comes and says, "Yo, this tenant of our church, I don't believe in it anymore."
Which
And
tenant was that?
that was everything dealing with 1844.
Okay.
The judgment itself, the prophetic timeline, what happened in 1844, what happened, the interpretation of what happened in Daniel chapters 8, verse 9, etc. All of that, he called it into question. He says, I don't believe it anymore. And I won't, like I said, I won't delve into what was true or not true, whether what believe or not believe. I will say that the church dealt with it in the way that the church usually deals with things, with a heavy hand.
Stamp it out.
Stamp it out, or eventually, like, he gave his defense. He wasn't disfellowshipped, but he was stripped of all of his credentials, right? He was deordained, and then a lot of pastors at that time, mostly pastors in America, they left the church as well. And that's something. And then those who stayed, a lot of times they kept their mouths shut, but still went on working. And from that time onwards, you've seen where, to be in the church, you have to follow the status quo. Or more to the point, to work for the church, you have to follow the status quo. And I say that as a layman, right? Because if you work for the church, there's a limit to what you can say or do. It's a sad truth. And you see that many persons, you see they become a lot more vocal about speaking out once they retire, because after you retire, there's no more power over you. And that's why, for me personally, I have said that I love my church, but I would never be an employee of the Adventist church, because, well, they'd fire me expeditiously. But,
and if you imagine me,
beyond that, that attitude that is there across many places, something that has to be worked on, but I don't know how it's going to be worked on. And you know that the church, as it is, it's very impervious to change. You discussed tithe a while ago, and there were many discussions, I guess, so what could be done, what could be improved, but where would those discussions go? We're having this discussion now, saying what can we do, these inflection points, what can we do for history, but how much impact will that have on the church itself? Because if you go to a conference session, you realize that the majority of delegates there are employees of the church. While the laity is represented, the laity will be a minority. And then a lot of those delegates may be persons who are chosen by the church persons for maybe their ability to stick to the status quo, as opposed to going out there and being a firebrand,
Right.
So one other golden calf that you can discuss in the future is, how can change be effected in the Adventist church? Because as it is right now, it's become self-perpetuating.
Yeah.
And the bylaws and if the church leaders themselves don't want to change, it's not going to change.
There you
And
go.
I believe that's why many persons, they speak the only way that they can with their tithe. They redirect their tithe. And I am honestly, I don't want to say I'm of two minds. I believe that God calls us to return tithe, and I believe that we have to support our church, our conference, our leaders with the tithe. And I believe that God will hold them accountable for whatever wrongs they have done with the funding. At the same time, when you see things happening and when you want to effect change, and you know that the only way to effect change is to deal with the money in a certain way, I can't disagree with persons, or I can say I understand completely when persons say, I'm redirecting my tithe to my local church because that's the only way they're going to listen to me. And so the conferences, the leaders, they have to find out some way to say, how can you as leaders more seriously and more impactfully take into account what the deity says. The structure of the church was how it was back in the day, but this is not that back in the day. Things are different now.
Very.
So the structure of the church may need to be reformed. The way we do things may need to be reformed. Persons are everything is different now. So how we do that, I don't know. But the leaders won't change until nothing changes until there's a impetus or some kind of crisis to force a change. And maybe that crisis will come with this upcoming inflection point of women's ordination. I mean, we were here in 2015 and etc. And it's still a sticking point. Eventually it must happen. It can't not happen. But what will happen when it happens? Is there going to be a split? Will the church divide over this? Is there going to be a situation between women's ordination, race situations, other things? Is it going to come? We're heading toward an inflection point in that regard, and only time will tell how that goes. But I know for a fact that the Adventist Church of today is not what it was in 1863, not what it was in 1957, not what it was in 1979. And the leaders would do well to be heeding the voices of those crying out in the wilderness.
Agreed. Somebody said, unless you're Whitley Phipps. Yeah. Well, he's pretty close to Richard. Well, I shouldn't say that. I don't even know. He may not be. God bless him.
He told it as it was, and that because he's Whitney Phipps. He doesn't need the church's money.
There is a certain independence. Yeah.
They fire him. He's all right.
And that's the unfortunate thing. That is, as you said, it's very unfortunate that we have structures that don't really allow people to speak unless they're retired, not an employee, or, are in many ways independent. To answer your question, Myra, his sermon was excellent. If you guys have not seen it, it's on YouTube. Check it out. But what we're saying is that while Whitley Phipps is an employee of the church, he does not depend on the church for his daily bread. If he decides to step away, he will be just fine. And it is unlikely, considering how well connected he is among the upper echelons of power, that the church would consider coming at him in any tangible way. Have I said that nicely?
So indeed.
Yes, so he has status and protection that a younger pastor fresh in his church would not have.
Yeah. And I mean, because being a pastor, I'm not a pastor, so I wouldn't say that. But I can imagine what it must be like to deal with, a church board. We all know what church boards are like.
Yeah.
And people, it's challenging. And the change you want to make, the changes you want to see, it's hard if you're you run into the old boys club, which I know you're familiar with, Daniel, in that sad way, and all those kind of things. So it's rough, and then many times you might end up becoming that which you were fighting against, because so that's why we have to focus on Christ. If we were to look at man, or if we were to say that God is our leader, then we would be of all men most miserable. But that's why you have to say, that's why your Professor Allen, I love what he's saying, what you said, lift up Christ, lift him up to see that bids us.
Yes.
Lift up Christ at all times, because he's who we're looking at. We're not looking at Ted Wilson, we're not looking at Ellen White, we're looking at Jesus Christ.
And I think when we come to the place where that is what we're actually doing, because right now it is so difficult to have some of these discussions without it becoming about the structure, the people, the Ted Wilson, the Ellen White, that it is very rare that we have these discussions through the lens of Christ. That's right. And that we see each other and that we relate to each other through the lens of Christ, and not the lens of you are apostate or you are holding us back, you old fogey.
Indeed.
So yeah, I love that. Okay, so you said our most recent inflection point is the women's ordination issue.
Yeah,
and I I I was very, for obvious reasons, very vested in that discussion. And one of the things that I found very disappointing was that all this effort was done
Mhm.
to approach the subject, biblically, scholastically. We did all these studies,
Mhm.
and then we use none of it.
Yeah,
And we defaulted back to but tradition.
I I don't know what to say on that. Um, because you can have, I mean, the when they had the TOSC, right, the
Mm,
theological, and you had the persons with their views, and persons were free to have their views, between
obviously,
those who were
everyone is.
saying they still didn't believe it, that's fine. Those who said we believe it, that's fine. Those who are saying there's a middle way, but we just taking time doing it. But like you said, afterwards it was just like cast aside and do what we want to do, and that's a reflection, I think, of the whole authority thing, the whole power thing, the whole doing things my way kind of thing. And like I said, it has to change, or if change doesn't come willingly, then change is going to be imposed because time is ticking. The realities of the challenges facing the church are not going to go away. The reality of demographic changes is not going to go away. The reality of persons not willing to be just bystanders anymore is not going to change. I'm not going to say you're going to have a revolution, but we have seen the decline in attendance across the different churches. We've seen where if God's will be accomplished, and He doesn't need us to do it.
Mm,
You know, we can be a part of it or we can take ourselves out of the running, but His will always be accomplished even if we drop the ball. Many persons have dropped the ball, and God's will still becomes accomplished one way or the other. And
mm,
it's for each of us, all of us, both as an institution and individuals, to be in a place to say, here I am, Lord, use me, and let me not limit your glory by what I can conceive.
mm.
That's what I would think in that regard. And I hope, I wait to see what happens going onwards in the next conference session that's coming up. Was it next year or year after?
It should
But
be pretty darn good. It should be either this year or next year. Yeah, I would think so.
yeah, so we'll see how that goes and how society goes itself, because that's a lot of things will be happening that year, and the church does reflect the society many times, especially in the
Mhm.
United States. But we live in interesting times, so we'll see how we're living in an inflection point now in more ways than one. So
Yes.
we just have to see how all of that goes.
Yes. Wow. We have covered a lot of history, and a lot of inflection points. And what I take from this is that we are repeating cycles. The
That-
same tug of war. It keeps the topic of the tug of war may change, but we do
Mm,
seem to constantly be in this tug of war, either between identity and traditionalism, or fundamentalism and liberalism. But there's we seem to always be in kind of a back and forth.
yeah.
Uh, do you think? And I mean, and perhaps this is just a result of sin and this is how it's always going to be, but do you think it is possible for us ever to get out of the tug of war? I mean, personally, I think that the answer would be, is what you were saying earlier, that we accept, what was the word you used? It was unity over conformity, I think. Was that the word you used?
Unity, not uniformity.
Unity, not uniformity. Yes. That if we accepted that, that would get us out of the tug of war, because now it's like, okay, well, on your side of the rope, it's 6. On my side of the rope, it's 9. And that's okay. But short of that, do you think there's anything that's going to get us out of this tug of war?
I would look at the prophecy of the latter rain by Joel, where he says,
Mm,
your young men will prophesy, your old men will have visions. And when that latter rain is poured out, for all of us to again lift up Jesus, when we have true revival, I think that will be the impetus. And not everybody is going to be on board, because there's going to be the shaking, the falling away. And Many times when there's revival, persons it's going to be a challenge because authority is going to be challenged. You may want people may want to control it, but you can't control the spirit. But I think it's possible, but it's not going to be possible by human strength. It's not going to be possible because we made our decision to say we will now be more united and we will do this and we will do that. It will be possible because the Holy Spirit has transformed the hearts of those who are willing, and He's saying the end is coming. The probation is closing. I'm pouring out my spirit on all flesh. Let's get that word out because the end is really nigh. So it's going to be the Holy Spirit that leads that unity, and it's us who will either allow the Spirit to come in our hearts that we may lift up Christ and do it, or if we're going to focus on what we want to do, what we've always done, that's where we've always done it, and then we may be passed over and we didn't even know that we were passed over. So whatever is possible is going to be done through the Holy Spirit, not through human effort.
Amen. Amen. So then as we're closing, what are like the top 3 things you would like someone to take from this discussion?
All right. One is that Adventism is a denomination that's dynamic. It has its challenges, but there is no shame in being an Adventist. You can be proud to be an Adventist. You can have you have good reason to be an Adventist. 2 is that Adventism needs to take a clear-eyed look at itself and to realize that sheltering its young people and sheltering its members from the truth of the reality of what its history is does not do it any favors. Once you know what you believe and why, you're able to be able to defend it. And when truth comes to light, it will always be a good thing. And 3, we are a movement moving towards the second coming of Jesus, and that needs to be our goal. We need to lift up Jesus always, and when we lift Him up, then everything else will fall into place.
Amen. I love it. Thank you so much, Jeff. Guys, did I not tell you that Geoffrey is a scholar and a gentleman? My goodness. And this is how, even though I do not consider myself I keep forgetting this word, a modernist? Moderate. Thank you. I don't know why I'm losing that word today, even though I do not consider myself a moderate. This is why Geoffrey and I have gotten along so well over the years, because I have profound respect for how he thinks, the research that he's done. Yes, as Wilner says, this is a balanced brother. Yes.
I appreciate that comment. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Yeah, so we will definitely have to have you back, because you were right. I think that will be really good to discuss how we can affect change, and how we can restructure in a way that will support change that works for everyone. I think that would be an amazing discussion. So
Indeed.
Yes, I'm staying on record now. I'm going to come back and tap you.
I'm always here once I'm available.
Wonderful. Guys, thank you so much for joining us. As you know, when we first put everything out, we put out 5 topics. We have done the 5 topics, but you have asked for so many more. So we're going to take off 1 week to recalibrate, and then we're going to come back with 5 more topics to discuss, because there is so much more out there. So keep an eye out for the next 5 topics that we're going to be starting after the following week. We're taking 1 week off to recalibrate, and then we are going to be back with 5 brand new topics where we burn the golden calf. If you miss any of the early parts of the live, it is okay. It is going to be on Facebook. It is also on YouTube. The total playlist of all the episodes that we have done so far and all the topics, they are all on YouTube in one place. You can find them there. I think the link is in the flyer, and we may have them on the scrolling bit too, maybe. I don't know. We'll work on that. But if you didn't catch us earlier, all of them are recorded. You can still get afterwards. Thank you guys so much for joining us. Thank you again, Geoffrey, for being here. And we will see you in 2 weeks.
Right.
Have a great rest of the night.
Bye-bye.